Constance hadn't meant to stop. She was on her way back from the pharmacy on Princess Street, a paper bag tucked under one arm, when she spotted a little girl standing near the gate of the Frontenac Montessori daycare. The child was waiting for someone, rocking heel to toe the way toddlers do when they're pleased with themselves for no particular reason, and something about the shape of her face made Constance's steps slow against the sidewalk. She stood there longer than was polite. The girl had Warren's jaw, that slight squareness, the same wide-set dark eyes, the small upward tilt at the corner of her mouth when she noticed something interesting. She was maybe 2.5, 3 years old at most, and she was every bit her father's daughter. Constance knew it before the older woman came through the gate and swept the child up into her arms. She knew, and the knowing sat in her chest like something cold and heavy that she'd put there herself. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Constance was standing at Rosemary's front door with her coat buttoned to the collar and an expression she'd practiced on the drive over. Composed, reasonable, appropriately remorseful. She had a grandchild. Blood was blood. Whatever had happened between the families, this was different. She hadn't counted on the door opening, and Rosemary looking at her, the way Rosemary looked at her. Not with anger, which Constance could have worked with, but with something worse. The flat, clear recognition of a woman who had already decided. Delia had not planned to fall in love with Warren Aldrich. She hadn't planned most of the good things in her life, and she'd stopped expecting them to announce themselves in advance. She was 27 when they met at a fundraiser for the Frontenac Community Food Bank, one of those draughty church hall events where the coffee comes out of a 40-cup urn that's been going since noon, and the volunteers outnumber the attendees. Delia was there because her supervisor at the clinic had asked nicely, and because she had no particular reason to say no on a Saturday in February in Kingston, Ontario. Warren had come because his mother's real estate firm had donated to the cause, and Constance believed firmly in being seen giving. They ended up beside each other at the silent auction table, both studying a framed watercolor of the harbor that neither of them had any intention of bidding on. He made a dry comment about the starting price relative to its artistic merit. She laughed before she could stop herself. By the end of the evening, they'd exchanged numbers under the fluorescent lights of the parking lot, while Constance stood near the exit in her good wool coat. Watching them with that particular expression, Delia would only come to recognize later. A slight tightening around the eyes. A rapid, private calculation. She should have read it sooner. But she was 27, and she'd spent her entire life being looked at sideways by one person or another, so she'd learned to look past it. It was a skill that had served her well in most situations. This was not most situations. Delia had grown up in a small rental house in the east end of Kingston, with her mother, Rosemary, and the particular resourcefulness that comes from having just enough. Her father had left before her first birthday. Rosemary didn't speak badly of him. She simply didn't speak of him at all, which told Delia everything she needed to know and nothing she could use. Rosemary had worked housekeeping at a hotel on Ontario Street for the bulk of Delia's childhood, covering extra shifts when the furnace needed work or the school sent home a reminder about the class trip. She was the kind of woman who made soup from scratch when money was tight and insisted the smell alone was worth the trouble. People in the neighborhood knew Rosemary's story. Most were decent about it. Some weren't. Delia had understood by the time she was 9 or 10 that certain people would always look at her mother and see a cautionary tale rather than a person. She'd decided early that those people were not worth her energy, and she'd held to that decision with a quiet consistency that her mother called stubbornness and meant as a compliment. What she hadn't prepared for was falling in love with the son of one of them. Warren was different from Constance in ways that held up over time, which mattered. He was thoughtful in the specific, unperformative way that's difficult to maintain if it isn't genuine. He remembered that Rosemary's arthritis was worse in cold weather, and showed up one November afternoon with a pair of good thermal gloves in her size, which he'd tracked down without making a thing of it. He didn't talk over Delia in front of his friends. He asked questions and then actually waited, for the answers. After 2 years together, when he asked her to marry him in Rosemary's kitchen with a ring he'd chosen himself and no photographer or orchestrated moment in sight, Delia said yes without hesitating. She should have hesitated more about Constance. She knew that now. The first visit to the Aldrich house on Berry Street was an education in surface courtesy. Constance offered tea and asked about Delia's work at the clinic with the specific tone of someone inquiring about a hobby. She mentioned twice, in the span of an hour, that Warren had studied at Queen's, and that the firm had been in the family for 30 years. When Delia mentioned that Rosemary had managed the hotel's entire East Wing by herself for 11 years, Constance smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and moved on to another subject. On the drive home, Warren said his mother just needed time to adjust to the idea. Delia said she understood. She did understand. She just understood something different than Warren did. The wedding was modest. Constance had proposed a small ceremony early in the planning, framing it as a matter of principle. The family matters, not the spectacle. And Delia had agreed because she genuinely didn't need a spectacle. She had her mother beside her in the front row. She had Warren at the end of the aisle, and that was the thing she'd cared about. What she understood only afterward was that Constance had already told her own social circle something larger was being planned, and had then made sure, through a slow, patient series of obstacles and delays, that it never materialized. It was the kind of maneuvering that was invisible until you'd stepped back far enough to see the whole shape of it. They moved into the house on Wright Crescent, technically Warren's property, purchased with money from his father's estate. Constance had a key. She used it regularly. The first months were a sequence of small indignities delivered in pleasant tones. Constance arrived on Tuesday mornings, while Warren was at the office, and found things to note. The way Delia organized the pantry, the cleaning products she bought, the fact that she hadn't folded the guest towels with the embroidered edge facing outward. She never raised her voice. She sighed. She offered unsolicited adjustments. She said things like, "I suppose you didn't have a lot of counter space growing up," in a register that was technically not unkind, which made it harder, not easier, to respond to. Delia called Rosemary every evening. Rosemary always picked up. "She's pushing to see where you stop," Rosemary said one night. "People like her, that's the whole project." "What happens if I don't stop?" "Then she pushes differently. But at least you know what you're dealing with." Claudia arrived in September, 8 months into the marriage. She was from Ottawa, an old family acquaintance, and Constance mentioned her the way she announced most things, as settled fact delivered at Sunday dinner. "Claudia's coming through Kingston this week. We'll have her Thursday." Warren nodded. Delia passed the bread and said nothing. Claudia was polished in the way expensive things are polished, all smooth surfaces that gave back a clear reflection. She and Warren had dated briefly at university, a fact Constance mentioned once with elaborate casualness, and then found occasion to reference 4 more times over the course of the meal, each time slightly differently. Claudia had studied business. Claudia had spent several years abroad. Claudia was back in Canada now, considering her options, thinking about settling somewhere. Constance looked at Claudia the way she had never once looked at Delia, like she was an investment worth making. Delia watched and said little. When she stood to clear the plates, Constance leaned toward Claudia and said, barely below her breath, "She's very quiet, isn't she? Not quite private, not quite public." A comment designed to be heard without being owned. Delia carried the plates to the kitchen. She did not respond. She had learned, in those months, that some things were intended to cost her more if she answered them than if she didn't. Over the weeks that followed, Claudia's visits became a fixture. She and Constance went to lunch at places. Constance had never once offered to take Delia. She appeared at Sunday dinners with wine and well-edited stories from Europe. Warren was easy with her in the uncomplicated way of people who share a long and settled history. He wasn't unkind, he wasn't interested, he just didn't see what was being built around him, because Constance was careful enough not to let him see it clearly. Delia saw it, she simply couldn't prove it yet. She found out she was pregnant in October. She hadn't told Warren. She was waiting for a quiet moment, just the two of them, something that wasn't competing with whatever version of his life. Constance was patiently reconstructing in the background. The evening everything came apart, she'd been home alone. Warren was at the office. Constance had called that afternoon to say she was sending Patrick, a man from Delia's clinic, who rented a unit in one of the Aldrich properties, someone Constance had apparently met at a tenant event, to drop off some clinic mail that had gone to the wrong address. Could Delia just let him in for a moment? Delia had said that was fine. She remembered Constance had stopped by earlier in the day and left a pot of tea on the counter. She remembered sitting on the couch. She did not remember anything after that. She came back to awareness with the overhead light on, and Warren's voice in the room and Patrick in the armchair across from her. Blinking and disoriented, equally unable to account for the hours, Constance was in the doorway in her good coat, phone in hand, her face arranged into an expression of wounded disbelief that Delia would later recognize, with the clarity of distance, as something she'd rehearsed. Delia told Warren about the tea. She told him she hadn't been conscious. She told him Constance had sent Patrick there on a pretext she'd manufactured. She told him, because there was no better moment, and the moment was already ruined, that she was 8 weeks pregnant with his child. Constance said quietly and clearly, "A baby can belong to anyone, Warren. Look at what you walked into." The thing that would ache longest wasn't what Constance said. It was the pause before Warren spoke. The pause in which he made his choice. Delia filed the police report the following morning. It took 45 minutes. She sat across from an officer with her hands flat on the table and her voice level and walked through the whole of it. The tea, the timeline, Patrick's own confusion. The photograph Constance had already taken on her phone before anyone in the room was awake. She noted that Patrick had told her, in those first bewildered minutes, that he had no memory of entering the bedroom, that his last clear recollection was sitting in the kitchen waiting for the paperwork. She noted that she intended to follow up with a lawyer. "You're not pursuing anything further against your husband right now?" the officer asked. "Not at this time," Delia said, "but I need this on record, all of it." She drove to Rosemary's house with a duffel bag and cried for 20 minutes in her old bedroom with the door shut. Then she stopped. She had always been able to stop. Rosemary had sat in the hallway the whole time, back against the wall, 2 cups of tea on the floor beside her. When Delia opened the door, they drank the tea and didn't talk about Warren. Rosemary asked whether the baby was all right. Delia said she thought so. "That's the thing that matters right now," Rosemary said. "Just that." The months that followed were hard in the unremarkable way, not spectacular, just slow and often tiring. Delia's colleagues at the clinic were professional enough not to press, and kind enough not to pretend nothing had happened. She saved carefully. She did every single thing the midwife recommended and took it seriously. She stayed in her old bedroom at Rosemary's until she found a rental flat 2 streets over that was small and bright in hers. She heard through someone at the clinic in the spring that Warren had married Claudia. The woman who mentioned it went immediately quiet, watching Delia's face. Delia said yes. I'd heard something about that and went back to what she was doing. She gave birth in June. A girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and her father's exact jaw, though Delia wasn't thinking about that in the delivery room. She named her Eleanor, after Rosemary's mother, and called her Ellie from the first hour. Rosemary wept in the unguarded way she almost never permitted herself, audible and real, and held the baby with the particular care of someone who knows precisely how fragile the things that matter are. The upstairs neighbor at Rosemary's house, a family doctor named Dorian, who worked at the walk-in clinic 2 blocks over, knocked on the door that evening with a casserole and an apology for the bathroom renovation he'd been making noise with. He left the food, said congratulations genuinely, and didn't linger. He came back 2 weeks later with another casserole, which made Delia laugh in a way she hadn't in months. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed about it, which made her laugh again. 3 years. Ellie learned to walk in Rosemary's hallway, steadying herself along the wall with enormous concentration. She started at the Frontenac Montessori daycare at 2, which she approached with the gravity of someone beginning a serious professional undertaking. She called Dorian the tall one until she learned his name, and then she used it like she'd always known him, which was the way Ellie processed most things she decided to accept. Delia had her flat, her work, her mother 2 streets away. On most days her life felt genuinely good, in spite of its smallness, but partly because of it. She had built something that belonged to her. She knew every corner of it. No one had a key she hadn't given them herself. Constance had not been in contact, not once, neither had Warren. The call came on a Wednesday. Delia was on her lunch break in the clinic staff kitchen when Rosemary rang. She answered to her mother saying, "Don't panic." Never an opening that inspired calm. "Ellie's fine," Rosemary said immediately. "She's right here with me. But there's a woman outside the daycare gate who told the teacher she's Ellie's grandmother and she's here to pick her up. I've never seen this woman in my life." Delia put down her fork. "Don't let her near Ellie. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 7. Constance was outside the gate in a cream-colored coat, and she had the look of someone who had come prepared to be reasonable. Delia knew that register well by now. Constance deployed reasonable when she wanted something she understood she didn't have the right to ask for. You came to her daycare, Delia said. Not a question. I've been trying to find a way to talk to you. You told the staff you were her grandmother and asked to take her. Constance's composure shifted in the small way ice shifts under pressure that hasn't broken through yet. She is Warren's daughter. Anyone looking at her can see that. You could see it 3 years ago, Delia said. You chose what you chose. I made a mistake, I can say that. Delia looked at her for a long moment. The pressed coat, the careful presentation, the posture of someone who still believed she was the person with the most standing in any room she entered. What you did, Delia said evenly, wasn't a mistake. You prepared it, you made the tea. You arranged for Patrick to come. You took the photograph before you woke anyone up, and then you stood in front of your own son and used what you'd set up to destroy his marriage. She paused. So no, you don't get to stand outside my daughter's daycare and call yourself her grandmother. I have legal standing as her. You have nothing, Delia's voice didn't rise. And if you come back here, to this daycare, to my flat, to my mother's house, anywhere near my daughter, I will take the police report I filed 3 years ago, with every detail I documented at the time, to a family lawyer and let them advise on what grandparental rights look like after what you orchestrated. Are we clear? Constance opened her mouth. Nothing followed. Rosemary stood behind Delia with Ellie on her hip and said nothing. She didn't need to. Constance walked back to her car. Delia watched her go. What happened to the Aldrich household over the following months reached Delia in fragments. Through the lawyer's letter, she passed directly to her own legal counsel. Through a former colleague at the clinic who knew someone tangentially connected to the firm, through the single piece of information that arrived and required no corroboration whatsoever. Claudia had been moving money out of the Aldrich real estate accounts for the better part of 2 years. She was methodical about it, and she had time, because Constance had championed her access to the firm's finances as a matter of keeping things in the family. By the time an external audit in November caught what she'd been doing, the total was significant. Claudia had known the audit was coming, she'd had access to the calendar, and she was gone before it landed. She sent Warren one message from a number he didn't recognize. You had a wife who told you the truth and a mother who showed you a photograph. You chose the photograph. I chose your family's money. I think we both made the decision that made sense to us. Warren apparently sat with that message for some time. He called Delia twice in the week after Claudia disappeared. She saw the calls. She set her phone face down on the kitchen table and went back to helping Ellie build a puzzle of the provinces and territories. Ellie was working through British Columbia with great stubbornness, convinced it was in the wrong place, and she did not call back. She didn't call back the second time either. The thing about building a life is that it happens mostly in moments that don't announce themselves as significant. It's a Tuesday night when Dorian stays for dinner because Ellie asks him to read one more story, and he says yes without making it complicated. It's Rosemary teaching Ellie to make her grandmother's potato soup, the exact same recipe she'd made when money was tight, and Ellie taking the wooden spoon with a seriousness well beyond her years. It's renewing the lease on the flat and realizing you thought of it as home before you signed anything. It's Dorian on a Sunday morning asking a question in the kitchen that he'd clearly been working up to for longer than that morning, and Delia realizing, with something she could only call amazement, that she'd already known her answer. She said yes. He picked her up and spun her twice, which woke Ellie, who appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, wanting to know what was happening. When they told her, she considered it with the gravity she brought to most decisions, said okay, and asked for cereal. Rosemary cried when she heard, the kind she'd been holding in reserve. The wedding was small, genuinely small, without any strategy behind it. Just the people who mattered, gathered in the garden of a friend's house in September, with the maples just beginning to turn, and Ellie in a yellow dress she'd selected herself after considering every other option at length. Rosemary sat in the front row in the September light and looked younger than she had in years. Delia wore deep blue, which Rosemary said made her look like herself, which was the only thing that mattered. Somewhere across the city, in a rented apartment that was considerably smaller than the house on Wright Crescent, Constance watched an evening program she'd already seen twice. The room was very quiet. Somewhere else, Warren poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window of a place he was still learning to navigate, thinking about a message he'd read more times than he could justify. Delia didn't know any of that. She was in the garden with her hands in Dorian's and Ellie between them, all three of them turning slow circles in the September grass to music that wasn't anything in particular. While Rosemary watched from a folding chair with her tea growing cold in her hands and a look on her face that Delia would try, later, to find the right word for. There wasn't one word. It was Rosemary watching her daughter dance. It was enough. It was more than enough. On the drive home, Ellie fell asleep in the back seat with one shoe on and her head listing against the car door. Delia reached back without looking and tucked her jacket around her daughter's shoulders. She looked out the passenger window at the Kingston streets, moving past in the dark, the lit storefronts, the quiet intersections, the lake just visible between the buildings if you knew where to look, and felt something she'd taken a long time to trust. Not happiness exactly, though it was that too. More like the knowledge that she had built this, her and Rosemary between them, one ordinary day pressing into the next, and that no one could reach inside it and take it apart. She had arrived here through everything that had tried to stop her. She intended to stay.